Hi, welcome to RFA's first live streaming show. I'm Jim Snyder. I'm an editor at RFA's Investigative and Special Projects team. I'm joined by my colleague Gemunu Amarasinghe, who, when he isn't brewing tea in the office kitchen, is our ace photographer. And joining us remotely is Frances Hui. Do you want to say hi, Frances? She is a pro-democracy advocate for a couple of groups. She works at the Committee for Freedom in the Hong Kong Foundation, and we're here to talk about, for the next 30 minutes or so, a project that Gemunu and I worked on with a colleague in London. We published a couple of weeks ago. It's about looking at the lives of 4 Hong Kong exiles in the 5 years since a summer of protests in Hong Kong over a law that would allow extradition to the mainland. And Frances is going to talk a little bit about why that was problematic to a lot of people in Hong Kong. So you can see the project, the story on rfa.org under the Special Projects section. So we'll get into the changes in Hong Kong that have happened since then, but we'll talk a little bit about the project and how it came to be initially. So, Gemunu, can you talk about kind of your interest in the project and what sort of you would hope to accomplish with this?
Sure. My interest is mostly based on my own personal experience of having to be forced to be in exile in 2009 for a couple of years.
Yeah.
But it's important to know that when I was in exile, I could contact my family. I knew I knew they were not going to go after my family or my friends. So I had some form of comfort having to be in touch with them, being able to be in touch with them. But then fast forward to early this year, when you look back what happened in Hong Kong and with the introduction of the national security law and eventual drafting of Article 23, it was pretty obvious this pretty vulnerable group of activists from Hong Kong who were in exile, in refugee status, most of them, could not even be able to being in touch with their families any longer without putting them in danger. So it was kind of bringing their vulnerabilities to a very high level, and it's almost very inhumane in my point of view. So my interest was mostly document the slice of their life, them being as refugees in the process. It's a very uncertain, difficult time period. So that was the initial interest. That's where I started.
Yeah. We had the idea for the project, I think, around the same time. My interest kind of grew out of something that happened specifically to Frances. So I'm part of these editorial meetings that happen at RFA every day. And so the heart of RFA are the 9 language services, as you know, but for our audience, that probably knows too, but that are run by and for the countries that we cover. And Joe, who's the head of the Cantonese service, at the editorial meeting one day in December, talked about how there were a group of activists, I think it was the second group of activists that this had happened to, that Hong Kong security police had put bounties on their heads, $1 million Hong Kong bounty, which is about 130,000 US dollars. And I was just thinking about, it just struck me as kind of absurd that, you would be a young person and have a bounty on your head for not much. So I wanted to talk to people about what that was like, what that meant. Were they fearful of being taken back to China? And particularly for a lot of these people, as I say, they're young, in their 20s. It's kind of a lot's going on just in order naturally, right? You're out of school, you're in a new city often, you're separated from your family, right. And then you have this on top of your head. So I was particularly interested in talking with Frances about this. And Frances, if you're online, you can kind of tell us a little bit about your sort of how you came to get involved in this project.
Well, I think at the beginning, Jim and Gemunu, you guys reached out to me, and I didn't know, we didn't know earlier, and I was a bit wasn't sure if I wanted to participate because I know that you guys want like a very personal sides of view of what my life is, but it's really hard for people like me who are always kind of very aware of security concerns. And for example, I never share where I live, like my home address and stuff like that, and having to kind of introduce two strangers into my life and to tell them what I do every day. I think at the beginning there was a process of kind of understanding, or like get to know each other, and building trust. And I think on one hand, as a journalist, I know that getting a personal sides of story of a person's story is very important to tell the issue behind it. I think it's a really good storytelling method as a journalist. But then on the other hand, as an activist, I know there is risk behind it. And so I kind of debated, within myself. And I do feel that there is a story there. I wanted to obviously be able to help and kind of coordinate with you guys. And I'm glad that you guys, I introduced you guys to the community as well. And everyone was also at first very hesitate, but then slowly I think there is a trust that was being built. And, I think genuinely the community was really happy and welcoming. And to see you guys are covering the story on the diaspora community, how people on the front or in the back are kind of using their platform to continue the fight for democracy in Hong Kong.
Yeah. Well, I think I can safely speak for Gemunu here. We're eternally grateful for your help, because you were also, that ended up being one of the big obstacles that we faced. The project took like 4 or 5 months to do, and it ended up working out because the story came out on June 9th, which is the day that the protest started. But I think the original plan was maybe to publish it a few months earlier. Part of the reason that it took so long was because it was hard to find people who were willing to talk, because it is kind of risky for people.
Yeah. And I remember I introduced some people, some other candidates to you guys, and they some of them were like, I don't really want to, do this. And so there are a lot of, I can see how, there are a lot of challenges to get us talking.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about, in 2019, you were a student at Emerson College. You grew up in Hong Kong, but you came to the U.S. and studied. You wanted to be a journalist. So kind of your name became publicized a few months before the protest really kicked off. Can you talk a little bit about what for?
Yeah, at that time I was studying at Emerson as a journalism student, and I was also an editor at the student newspaper, the Berkeley Beacon, and specifically on a section called Living Arts. And we have a section in the Living Arts section that's called Persons of Color column. And one day I just have this idea of maybe it would be good to write about Hong Kong, because I had experience of with Chinese students at my school.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times when I introduce myself coming from Hong Kong, I would get all sort of different reactions from them. And sometimes they're not, being hostile or not nice, but I think they just grew up thinking that Hong Kong is no different from China. Mm-hmm. Or they have a different views of how Hong Kong people are like. And I don't think they really understand why there is a difference of ideology or a difference of values. They kind of see us as the same. And at the same time, I have friends who are not Chinese or like just American. And then they would ask me, oh, Frances, can you tell us more about Hong Kong? Like, is it different from China? Is it part of China? I think it's really hard for someone who doesn't know the history to really understand what's going on there.
Right.
Because Hong Kong was part of China. It's part of China, but it's quite different, right? Like, it's running in a very different system. It has its own government. And so I was like, maybe I can write an article about Hong Kong and kind of just let people know about the little history behind it, how the government works, how the system works, and why people in Hong Kong do not really identify as Chinese. And so I just started writing it. And one thing I think it's really funny was I didn't come up with the headline. I came up with multiple different
That happens all the
options.
time.
Yeah, and
That's what every
then
journalist says. Oh, the headline's not mine.
the, yeah, like on the production night, uh,
Yeah.
we're all trying to come up with a good headline, and I suggested the I'm from Hong Kong, not China, but I feel like it's really aggressive. But then with all the options, my editor chose the most aggressive headline, and
And
I
then
was like,
people
okay,
sort of
let's do
responded
it.
aggressively to it too, right? So you got some pushback from Chinese students or the Chinese community a little bit. And
Yeah,
the Washington Post, I know, profiled you. So you had sort of a raised kind of platform. And from that, you were in the United States, but you helped organize kind of solidarity protests around this. And then you covered
that's
as a
right.
journalist, right? A volunteer journalist for when the protests were happening a few months. I think you went back and did some work there. So can you just tell us a little bit about the extradition law and why that was problematic?
Yeah, so the extradition law was introduced by Carrie Lam, the chief executive at that time, and the general idea is to pass an amendment on the extradition law and allow Hong Kong fugitives to be extradited to China for trial. And the reason why it's very problematic is because Hong Kong, as I said, it's running in a very different system from China.
Mm-hmm.
The principle of one country, two systems basically allow us to continue with this capitalist way of life. And we have our own courts, we have our own law. We run by rule of law instead of rule by law, right? And
Yeah, you had
so
freedom of expression and
exactly.
yeah, and
And
people could protest. Like there were protests throughout the could.
Well, yeah, exactly. And I think what people were very worried about is the fact that this would be used by Chinese governments to monitor and to persecute journalists, lawyers, or activists or politicians
Mm-hmm.
for anybody who are a source of dissent. They would be targeted and be extradited to China under Chinese law and be trial in Chinese court. And what we always say is in China, there is a 99.9% of conviction rate. There's no way that you can fight in the court. It's very different from Hong Kong, like having a very separate rule of law and separate sets of systems.
So it was another attack on these one country, two systems thing. And I mean, the
Yeah.
irony is that the extradition law never really took place, but there's been some laws that have further restricted expression and speech, which we'll get back to in a second. So, Frances, as we said, you were graciously the first person to participate, and through your efforts, we met other exiles. Quen Lam, who was a spokesperson for the Hong Kong Democracy Council, Bajio Luang, who was a pro-democracy advocate, who won a seat to the Legislative Council, but he was never allowed to sit in it, and he was actually jailed for a month for protesting and trying to claim his seat. And Amity Chan, who, like Frances, was a student in the U.S. at the time, but her artwork, she was a student at Baltimore Art College, and developed some protest art and doesn't feel comfortable to go back home. So if we could shift back to the story a little bit, Gemunu, for a project like this, I mean, you're out shooting every day. I made that crack about your tea brewing, how much time you spend tea brewing, but mostly you're out shooting photographs. So, how do you approach this project differently from a typical shoot on Capitol Hill or a protest or anything that you might cover?
It's very different, and some of the elements we already talked about.
Yeah.
The biggest hurdle is like actually winning the trust of people that you're going to spend a lot of time.
Right.
I mean, they're not just ordinary bunch of people. Some of them had bounties on their head, and as Frances quite rightly mentioned, like why on the earth she should trust me to allow me to come into her apartment and photograph the way that I was imagining to do. So there's a lot of trust building, and then eventually and that's the initial hurdle, and that's the biggest one. But once that stage was passed, it was we always thought it's going to be visually heavy. Then my approach was always, it was going to be like a slice of life, like social documentary kind of style. So we have in this piece we have reasonable amount of we have environmental portraits, and we have people in their own houses, which is kind of like the hardest. We need once when you get into a house and start photographing a person, the house reflects what you are, and that's to show the personality of the person. So at the same time, it exposes them to the elements that they shouldn't be exposed into.
Right.
So that amount of trust that you build and like using what you have very carefully, it's just kind of like one of the biggest things. And then moving forward, like I encourage people to go back to the story if they have time and pay close attention to some of the pictures. And there are some of them have signs and logos and little bits and pieces about, in not very prominently but somewhere in the picture, that somehow translate to the person given that stage of their life.
Yeah.
So I don't know how many of you have noticed that. I thought that was interesting. Then moving further, like it was going to be a story about like individuals, and we try to avoid pictures of groups. And anytime we have the groups, there are people who don't want to be in the pictures. So the hard part is like for Hong Kongers that in the story, the community is a very important aspect of their well-being. So we have to have the community in a way, and the joy that they share with them, and how they all stay together as a team. So we ended up including pictures from the DC Dragon boat race, and basically we had to blur some of the faces because, on their request. So there's kind of a lot of mutual trust on what we use, how we use, and what we do not show in a situation of like, so some of that. And then eventually moving forward, there's an element of loneliness in everybody's life one way or another. So there's, DC is a vibrant, great city, but you can be very lonely in this city at the same time by speaking to each and every one of them. So just kind of like it's kind of moody, and we choose to use black and white just to get rid of the color, and it's a distraction in this piece of in this line of work. So we went along with black and white, and that's basically that's what it is.
Yeah. So what's great working with you, Gemunu, is you're not only a great photographer, but you're a really good reporter, and you work nights and weekends, so I don't have to. So, but because all the key anecdotes, including the opening one, was Frances protesting outside the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office. There's this great video that you captured, and it's not included in the story, but it's almost like an outtake of Frances kind of like laughing about how kind of absurd the situation is. Which sort of I captured kind of, which I thought captured kind of like a theme of the piece, like in kind of this disorienting, bewildering kind of life as an exile. Suddenly your life you grew up in Hong Kong protesting, and then suddenly you weren't allowed to anymore, and now your life is completely different. You have to sever your ties with your family and friends. The trick for writing, it was always going to be a visually heavy piece. For the trick, as one of the writers of it, is kind of incorporating a lot of information, but you didn't want to go too long. They're four interesting people, but they all sort of essentially have the same story, and it's not, sadly, an unusual story. There are a lot of refugees in the world. But the anniversary of the protest provided a little bit of a news peg, and we decided to do, they're not really profiles, right? It's not really a close examination of Frances's life. We didn't go through her trash or anything like that. But
we didn't?
No, I didn't. Oh, you did. I'm
No,
sorry,
I
I
did
shouldn't speak for you. So just kind of sketches, anecdotes, kind of give a flavor of that. And I also didn't want, there's plenty of sadness in the story, but Frances bears it well, and the sense of humor is important to it. Sort of to her method of coping. I think that's fair to say. So, as I said earlier, Francis, what kind of got me interested in the story is the bounty that was put on you and some of your compatriots. So, do you remember that day, what it was like, and how has that kind of affected your life since?
I got woken up by my cat.
You have two cats. I was going to mention that earlier. You're
So,
a
and then
pro-democracy advocate and a cat lover.
yeah, I woke up that morning because in that morning my cat was trying to steal food from the sink.
You should clean
And
your
then I
dishes.
woke
This is
up,
just a sort of a pet peeve of mine.
I was like, man, this is just every day, it's every morning. And then I woke up and then I was like, let me pick up my phone and see my messages. And I got a lot of messages from different journalists, and I was like, oh shoot, I immediately know what's happening because
Yeah.
we had the first round in July, which was like 4 months before I got the bounty. And as soon as the first bounty came, I was kind of thinking about what I'm doing here in DC and whether I would be in trouble as well. And I know for a fact that, being kind of advocating for sanctions against Chinese officials and Hong Kong officials, these are really sensitive stuff. And for them, for the government, is very bustling word, sanctions. And so I kind of already knew. I was obviously, I think even though I had the expectations that one day I'll be kind of be on the wanted list and having the bounty placed on my head, it still feel a bit jarring to know that, from now on my life would be different because I would have to really officially cut ties with a lot of people that I have been contacting in Hong Kong. And there is it's something that kind of tell you that this is it.
Yeah.
It's an absolute death certificate that you can't go back to Hong Kong.
Mm-hmm.
People who are associated with you would face risks. In Hong Kong, I think specifically I'm talking about, my family, right? Who are still in Hong Kong, and because we have seen to the first round of activists, their families were being questioned, and so that was it was really jarring moment, even though we have all kind of seen what happened in the past, and I already have a prior expectations that it would happen. So yeah, I would say that my life became really different after that. That's for sure.
So I kind of skipped a little bit of your life. So you went back, you were a student and you went back for a week to cover it for an online news outlet. And then you come back to the United States. You go back to Hong Kong, I think, for about 4 months. And then you get some indication that you're not safe. So kind of what were you doing in Hong Kong that kind of drew the attention of the authorities, if it was in Hong Kong, or maybe it was your work organizing protests around the world?
It was very much, as I mentioned earlier, most of the time during the 2019 and 2020 movement, I spent most of the time in the US, and a lot of them include engaging with US officials and coordinating rallies around the world in supporting the movement. And these are all just kind of what I was doing kind of on the surface, and then in the back I was kind of managing channels and doing a lot of information exchange with people on the ground. And the fact that I was involved in a lot of the advocacies with foreign governments was one of the things I covered in national security law, right? The part about colluding with foreign forces, and personally in the past I've advocated for Hong Kong independence, and that's also kind of part of what's violating the national security law. And I remember, I don't know if I shared this when I was talking to you guys, but when it was first announced in China, I really, like when it was first passed and imposed, I was not, I feel like it was just a way to kind of shock people and to kind of scare people away, to intimidate people. And so I was like, this is not real, they're not going to use it in a large extent, because I kind of still feel that there is hope. But I was wrong. I mean, I made a post on that day that say all the things that violate national security law, because I genuinely think that, it's not serious. But then 2 weeks after that, I still remember I continued to go to the Democratic primaries to help campaigning for some of the candidates. And then I keep hearing from some of my trusted friends who have insider source, and they were telling me the first group of people that they would target are people who were involved in foreign policies, foreign advocacies, in the outside world.
Mm-hmm.
And I would be one of the people, even though I might not be the priority.
Right.
I would be one of the targets eventually.
So that's an
And
incredible, a decision with huge import in your life, right? That you have to make kind of on the spur of the moment. You're 21 at the time, I think. Remember something like that?
yeah, 2021.
2021, where you decide like, okay, I'm leaving Hong Kong maybe for the last time.
When I first left, I mean, my friends really want me to go. I didn't want to go, and they keep trying to convince me, and they were like, maybe it's not that serious as you think, maybe it's not that serious as we were describing. Maybe it's what you were saying. It's you're not going to be targeted. So why don't you just go to the U.S., maybe stay for 6 months or a year and see what's going to happen, and then maybe you can be quiet for a little bit and then come back. Like, let's just see what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And then 2 weeks after that, they had their first arranged arrest. 1 week after I left, Tony Chung was arrested. Then Jimmy Lai was arrested. And then going forward was the Hong Kong 47. I think in December 2020, I see the trend, and I realized that there is a huge risk of going back, and maybe I will be in a better use to continue to use my voice, my platform, to advocate for Hong Kong in where I am at a safe place. I'm already fortunate enough that I could come here.
Mm-hmm.
So why don't I just stay and announce that I'm leaving indefinitely? So that's kind of like the moment that I really made the decision that I'm never able to go back to Hong Kong.
So
But it was like when I left, it was kind of just like tricking myself, right? Like, oh, and it's not final. Like,
Yeah.
But then I was crying all the way through the flights, right? Yeah.
So we only have a few minutes left, but we've talked about the national security law a bit. Can you just briefly say what it is and why it's problematic?
So in short way of describing, it criminalizes any act of sedition, subversion, colluding with foreign forces, and I'm blanking out at the other
That's
one.
okay.
I mean, this is just a legal term,
Right.
right? But in a more general sense, it targets any kind of act of dissent, and a lot of, at least 200 people are now arrested and charged under the national security law, including the Hong Kong 47 who are now on trial, Jimmy Lai, and the maximum sentence of that law is life sentencing. Minimum is three years. And a lot of the people I know, some of my friends, people that I campaigned for in the primaries, all of them are in jail because of that. And we are going to expect the verdict and the sentencing in 2 months. So I think that's something, should be, the world should pay attention to. And I really do hope that, after the Hong Kong 47 verdict and the Jimmy Lai trial, we could still continue to generate attention on the Hong Kong movement and to continue to advocate for the cause, because this is not the end, right? There are still people living in Hong Kong, staying in Hong Kong, trying to make a living and trying to tell people about our story, our values, and our, sharing our fights for freedom.
It's not the end of the project either, right? You're going to do a video in a couple of weeks, correct?
Yeah. So we have all the elements lined up. So it'll come out eventually sometime soon.
One of the nice things about working on this project is Frances, and she mentioned this earlier, introduced us to this Hong Kong community, and we could see how much how important it is for you guys to sort of that sense of community and home, and how you sort of rely and depend on each other for support, which is interesting. And I think maybe the video will bring some of that more out, some more of that out. Well, thanks again, Frances, for your involvement in the project and for coming on with us today. And I think we'll leave it there. So thanks for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you, Frances.